At James Pickman's house, the sound of the doorbell echoed deafeningly off the walls of the dingy old mansion. The same tones sounded 3 more times before the owner lazily almost crawled to the door and with even more laziness, or perhaps fatigue, pressed on the brass handle with a serpent-like curled end. In front of the door, an already impatient man about 30 years old, with the first signs of early onset curves, was clutching a black hardcover notebook in his hand, and nervously or out of stupid habit, incessantly fiddling with the pen button. "Good morning, I'm Tom Hyan. We had an appointment for an interview," he greeted, making an impression as if all his tension had spread to his bones. "Good morning," replied James, shaking his hand. "Feel free to come inside," he added, eloquently emphasizing with a hand gesture for him to enter. He entered a wide hallway filled with heavy air, as if the house had not experienced even a brief airing in a decade. Probably the owner was accustomed to the dampness and the overwhelming dampness. The landlord was clearly not interested in keeping things tidy. Right next to the entrance, on a small table standing by the wall, on which hung a dirty mirror with an old metal frame, lay a carelessly stacked pile of papers and newspapers. It seems that one day they simply fell on the floor and James unwillingly bent down to pick them up. Judging by the fact that there were a few more small, colourful pieces of paper lying next to it, he did not indulge in this simple activity 100%. Opposite the entrance, a pale red carpet in abstract black and green patterns led to a wooden staircase, nearly 2 meters wide, that was clearly up for renovation. Tom was not surprised to see that one of its corners was curled upward. "I wonder how many spiders and other nasties must be nesting here," he thought, as he ran his eyes over the ceiling, looking for hanging cobwebs, but the pale, cool light emanating from the chandelier prevented a close inspection. When his eyes did not pick up anything interesting, he asked himself another question. Why does he shine the light in the middle of the day, after all? It would be enough just to raise the blinds. Is he afraid of natural light or what? Before his host told him to follow him, he pointed out one, in fact 2, identical details constituting the decoration to the aforementioned staircase. Namely, there were 2 identical meter-high statues, resembling some mythical creature, or an unremarkable creation of the imagination, resulting from the hybridization of animals and humans. In fact, the appearance of the statues themselves was not impressive in itself. What was striking was that they were clean, even polished. In front of the entrance to the library, where the interview with the writer was scheduled, 2 paintings were hanging. On the right was Edvard Munch's The Scream, while on the left was Giovanni Brigolin's The Weeping Boy. Both of these paintings had always seemed eerie to Tom, but he had never seen either of them hung on a wall, let alone 2 such works, side by side. A truly disturbing sight. Combined with the aversive surroundings, their horror grew with every moment a person hung his gaze on them. Fortunately, Tom was not forced to admire this sinister art. The library was an impressive book collection, a mass of bulky volumes on the spines of which were titles in various languages. Latin seemed to predominate, but it would be impossible to make a definite statement that this was the case. The shelves were so high that it would have been impossible to reach almost half of the items without a ladder, which, incidentally, the library was stocked with. The room had its charms, but Tom couldn't stand one thing. Crossing the threshold of the room, he hoped that he had freed himself from the horror emanating from the steamy paintings adorning the entrance. On the opposite wall between 2 bookcases hung a huge painting that left no marginal distance from the ceiling, floor, and wooden bookcases. It was a painting as eerie as the previous ones. Its size emphatically emphasized its inexplicable yet phenomenal aura of unease. This wicked work was a painting by Bill Stoneham from a free translation, His Hands Resist. James snapped out of Tom's suspended contemplation, suggesting that he sit down in a leather armchair at a round wooden table. Sensing his tension, which once again returned to the journalist, who was some 15 years younger than him, he offered a whiskey, which Tom could not refuse. Admittedly, there was no ice in the glass, but this was no problem for him. "In that case, let's start our conversation," he took up, putting the glass down on the table. "Kindly, what do you wish to learn from me?" he replied gently, placing his hands on the backrests. "To begin with, I would like to ask why, such a long time after the release of your, it seems, the best book of your career so far, you agreed to an interview. As I recall, I am the first person in 2 years to receive this honor. Why did you abandon the media if they had not been a problem for you until now? I even dare say that showing your own image brought you fun." The Beginning of Darkness was, and is, a special title for me. I worked on it for many years. In the meantime, I published other novels, because I was not ready to top this story. Creating content for it was a non-trivial adventure. The book required layers of energy and time from me. I had to gain a great deal of knowledge, experience, and understanding in order to make my life's work, not so much as to cause a sensation or bring out people's most hidden fears even from themselves, but I required of myself that the beginning of darkness be so real that the reader, absorbed in reading it, would realize that it was our anti-hero. It had to be convincing enough for everyone to think that every horror-filled situation is real and happening in the real world through the content being read, and the word being read turns into truth. It is very difficult to achieve such an effect. I would say it is an inhuman achievement, one would like to say almost diabolical. Imagine descending into a dark, disgusting basement where even tangible evil lurks. You descend step by step, fully aware that you are heading for your own perdition, but nevertheless you go lower, despite the fact that the door to the basement is still open and you have a choice, and yet you go lower anyway. Each step in this basement symbolizes another chapter. 33 steps separate us from knowing the truth about our nature and the world, because we only think we know it, but in reality, it is quite different. James interrupted his speech to reach for his glass, reducing the liquor in it by half. Tom did the same. He felt overwhelmed. At first he assumed that because of what he had heard, and most of all from the way the words came to him. The dark author used a remarkable style to convey his thoughts. That gesticulation and tone, a bit like he believed what he wrote was true. He seemed visibly winded and impatient before whatever else he had to add. Tom, however, approached his anxiety about his interlocutor with some reserve, convinced that he was not the one creating this pressure on him. The painting, considered by many to be cursed, was responsible for everything. Despite being a copy, few would dare to hang it on the wall, and still in such a format. Tom had a feeling as if the hands depicted in the painting wanted to reach for him. In that moment he realized that James, communing with such works of art, must have been a true, dedicated horror fanatic, which certainly had its private consequences. In such a large house, no one wanted to live with him. If the writer himself becomes a fictional character in the real world, not even fame can protect him from his own self, Tom thought. "Mr. James, let's move on to the plot. Weren't you worried about stiffness? After all, a university professor who conducts various archaeological researches and has an additional interest in religious studies, during his work comes across an incredible discovery that could change the fate of the world. Hasn't this happened in pop culture before sometimes? I know of a ton of movies that begin similarly. Beginning with King Lovecraft and continuing to the present day, this pattern has run its course. Of course, not every contemporary written story of this type has such a reception as yours. I will admit that the plot with the strange books that the protagonist compared was indeed original. There was a little truth and a little lie in each, and whether the mystery could be solved, depended on knowledge and interpretation to put the real clues together properly. Well, that's right, interjected James, distinguishing truth from lies. The hero had the answers all the time in front of him. However, he was unable to see his problem from a different perspective. It was enough to give in to instinct for a moment to free his mind from deformed thoughts. He reached for a glass and moistened his lips. Deformed thoughts, Tom repeated. Of course, Mr. Hyan. Please note how people hastily draw conclusions. Sometimes the more educated they are, the more they do not allow other solutions. Even though their minds are in great shape, they fail to open up to what is actually most important. Only after the protagonist meets a mysterious man in white and gets into a brief chat with him does he open up to new possibilities. Well, just who is this man in white? He seems to give the impression of being omniscient. Is he some kind of demon? Probably one of the ones described in the aforementioned books. However, he seemed to have some internal characteristics that were familiar to me. I can't exactly compare where I encountered them, but I know they are familiar to me. What or who were you inspired by when creating this character? As a horror writer, I must be interested in mysterious matters, he said in a subdued voice. A light bulb flicked in the room, as if lightning had struck nearby several times. Ah, this installation, gasped James. I understand. Professional secrecy, replied Tom, ignoring the digression. The protagonist, after meeting a mysterious stranger, begins to lose control of himself. We know that he received something from him in a small envelope, but it was not explained in the novel. What was in it affected his psyche and the actions he takes. First, he argues with a friend, then he steals research notes from other professors, falls into a persecutory mania, and when the same friend notices that something is wrong with him and tries to help him, he ends up with his throat cut. Readers float various theories about this. Will this be explained in the next volume, or are you not planning a follow-up? Continuity is a very relative issue. Tom didn't understand the meaning of the words, but quickly forgot about them when something hit the glass until he jumped up in his seat, while the writer didn't even blink his eyes. It's probably a bird, James explained. They often get confused by the road. Tom reflexively looked at the painting. He had the irresistible impression that the girl with black eyes was looking directly at him, but he managed to shake himself off and the image lost its unnatural qualities. They both drank the first portion of whiskey. The host got up from his seat, walked over to the bar, and took out the double black again. As he returned to the table to pour, Tom pointed out something. Is there anyone else in the house besides us? Why do you ask? I make no secret of the fact that I am a loner, so there are no other people here besides us. I had the impression that the floor had squeaked. Naturally. In the end, I almost every stroll to the bar. Old house, old floors, you understand. I understand perfectly, but the thing is that the creaking was not coming from this room. You can rest assured. I guarantee it's home. You are probably right. I would like to use the restroom. How to get to it? Turn right into the corridor behind the stairs, last door on the right. Thank you, I'll be right back. Tom pulled the doorknob and was already about to step inside the room when he suddenly felt a cool, piercing tell smacking his neck. He turned around to see what it was caused by. As it turned out, the door from across the hall was also open, although he was fairly certain that when he walked down the hallway, all the doors were closed. He approached to peek through the resulting gap. It was certainly the entrance to the basement. He was tempted to check a nuance, but refrained. He closed the door, cutting off the flow of damp basement air, and headed for the toilet. A wave of anxiety flooded him on his way out. He strained his hearing to hear any sounds coming from below. He also took out his phone and turned on his flashlight. He saw only a long, narrow, and arched descent made of brick. The beam of light was too weak to illuminate what was at the very bottom. 33 degrees, he thought. Is anyone there? He did not hear an answer. With a quick step, he returned to the library but did not find his host inside. He reassured himself by thinking that it was probably James, who had gone downstairs to get something. So he returned to the table, grabbed a glass, then noted something in his notebook. Setting it aside, he noticed that on the other side lay a yellowed envelope, which did not bring him any positive associations. He was alone in the room. Well, maybe not really, considering the accompanying gloomy image of William Stoneham, from which the girl's eyes penetrated him with infinite darkness. Time to end this interview, he thought. In Tom's eyes, basically nothing looked like something he should be afraid of, but there was some particularly heavy atmosphere in the house. Feeling someone else's presence would probably sound too simple to describe what the journalist felt. However, he was sure that James Pickman was somewhat eccentric. The entire decor of his residence and himself told him so. Therefore, the highlight of the meeting now was to end it and politely thank him for the interview. "Beautiful, right?" said James, standing behind Tom's chair. Tom's blood pressure jumped, and, through surprise, he choked on his whiskey. "Mr. James, but you scared me devilishly. How did you even enter the room? After all, I closed the door, and I didn't hear you enter." "I just know my house and can move silently in it," he replied in an excited voice while staring at hands that resist. "As I understand it, the art of painting is a source of numerous inspirations for you." "Infinite inspiration," the writer corrected him. "I have the impression that you see a little more in the paintings than the average bread-eater." "And yes and no," replied James, puzzled, obstructing the view of the ghostly girl. "It's not a question of whether I see more or less. If we both looked at the painted hair, we would probably both see him, wouldn't we?" Tom muttered under his breath. "It all depends on what we are really looking for in a painting. You want to admire the hair rendered in even the smallest detail, while I am interested in what is behind it. Looking at William Stoneham's work, you only see hands pushing against the glass, while I see who is really there and trying to get out." "So, who do you see on the other side?" Tom spread his hands. "I see people like you there. People who go down into the depths of the basement, although they know that the door behind them stands open all the time, and they can turn back at any moment. But no, you guys prefer to go forward," he shouted, frightening Tom. "You go consciously to perdition, like a mouse into a trap, like a fly flying into a decoy. Why do you think this picture is so big? Well, think. Mr. James, I don't understand your behavior. Why don't we finish the interview another time?" "Well, it is so huge because it has to accommodate a lot. If there is not enough space, I will demolish the ceiling. As you can see, the basement I already lacked." "I don't really understand." "Then come over and see." Tom stood up. He bent down, as if bowing to the figures on the canvas, and only after looking closely did he notice that the painting did not touch the floor at all, but came out of it. Its second part was under the library. "I don't understand anything, Mr. Pickman." He straightened up, terrified, and in that moment, he learned the true definition of horror, for the girl in the painting had disappeared. He made a quick turn toward James, and the latter was already standing in front of him, holding an envelope in his hand. "Take it with you," the writer ordered, pressing it into his hand. "I demand an explanation," Tom floated. "You liked her. You should not have come here." He chuckled huskily, turned around and headed toward the library exit. "What the fuck is going on?" He let out a shrill scream. He even squealed when something grabbed his shoulders and started pulling him backwards. Although Tom was panicked, to the limit of the human psyche, even in this state he was able to spot something in the corner of the room. On a tall bookcase, a crouching small figure was painted in a dark corner. Even in the gloom, he could see those dark eye sockets, which provided a contrast to the rest of the darkness. Like a wild animal, the girl jumped down from the bookcase without making any noise, as if she had not weighed in at all. She ran up to Tom, transfixed by the long arms coming out of the painting. She looked at him in such a peculiar way that her bad intentions could be read as infatuation, but the journalist certainly did not care about her adoration. The girl moved closer. Her hands wandered over Tom's face, as if a blind man trying to read facial features. She fixed her drab gaze on him. Time seemed to stop. There was silence. This was the end of the interview with James Pickman, and all that was left of Tom was an envelope. 3 hours later, the bell rang at the writer's home. "Good morning, Mr. Pickman. It is an honor to meet you personally. Thank you for taking the time for me, especially since you last interviewed me 2 years ago. No problem at all, Mr. Peter Nicholson. So, Mr. Nicholson, I invite you to come to my library. We'll have a chat about literature, but be forewarned, I may fuel your fears." Peter laughed. When they found themselves in the library, the journalist immediately turned his attention to the gem. "Great painting, Mr. Pickman. I happen to know all sorts of unusual works and can say a lot about them. And what do you say about my eyes? It differs from what William Stoneham painted. In this painting, there are definitely more hands. What perceptiveness. Treat yourself to a drink."